Now, you mentioned
Honestly.
worldwide figures there, and I wanted to get into this because you mentioned, and we know that your Oscar-winning documentary short, Period, End of Sentence, does look at a community in India. And I think in the US, when we hear the words period poverty, it might sound like an issue that is not an American issue, but is instead something that affects people in disadvantaged communities globally, but maybe not at home. Can you talk about the difference between what we see in the United States versus what we see more globally?
Yes, and I can honestly say that period poverty, and just to be clear, period poverty is the lack of access to menstrual products, a safe means to manage one's period. It's a lack of access to clean toilets, clean water, and a lack of access to reproductive education and what is happening with your own body. So that, for instance, here in the United States, Florida has just passed the quote unquote "don't say period" bill. So that if I am 10 years old and I have gotten my period, and periods are happening younger and younger for women all over the world, for girls, uh, and I'm an educator or a nurse, and this little girl who is 10 years old is scared because why am I bleeding? I now, if I'm an educator in Florida, can't say, this is a natural process, you're okay. So lack of education is one hurdle we see everywhere. Again, lack of affordability, absolutely the same in the United States. What it happens around the world is the same thing with education, but in countries around the world, period poverty will make you more vulnerable to becoming a child bride, so that you are forced into marriage because once you menstruate, you're able to have a baby. Therefore, you're valuable to somebody who wants to use you to have his babies, where men and boys have the power in that society. You are more vulnerable to being sex trafficked. So menarche, which is the onset of menstruation, becomes a sort of dangerous clanging bell. I'm here and I can reproduce, which is really sad. So that in countries around the world, just when a young woman is getting her intellectual and physical growth together and can go and pursue her dream of being an engineer or a teacher, whatever it is, she may then be forced into early marriage, into the sex trade if she wants to survive. In the United States, by the way, we do have people who will exchange sexual favors just for something as simple as a tampon or a pad. So lest we think it's easy in the United States or in higher income countries, it's not always the case. And interestingly, some countries that we think of as quote unquote low income or developing have done much more radical things to create gender equity and menstrual equity. I think Kenya was the very first country to make sure that we had free pads in schools.
You've mentioned that when you started the PAD project, the term period poverty didn't exist. And I was looking at a UN report from earlier this year that indicated that there are still millions and millions of people worldwide affected by this issue. 1.5 billion people worldwide lack access to sanitary cleaning conditions, like clean showers, clean toilets, which you mentioned. And so, Melissa, I'm wondering, since you've started this work, or even since you were on the 50 or 50 list a few years ago, how much progress and change have we seen on either a national or global level? Are the numbers improving at all?
Yes, I'm very encouraged, and I feel like one thing that continues to fascinate me about this movement for menstrual equity, and there are so many great thinkers and movers in this space, and I wish I could name them all. But if you think about it, women have been menstruating since the beginning of humans, and yet this movement for menstrual equity is really 10, 15 years old. It's very young. We are in the nascent stages. Yet, in that time, there were no states. Every state had the tampon tax. Now, only 20 states still have the tampon tax. No schools provided tampons and pads for free. Now, many schools do. And in the zeitgeist, if we're talking about in the culture, this idea that tampon Tim is a big joke, that he should be ashamed to be called tampon Tim, sort of harkens back to an earlier cultural moment when people my age will have all seen the TV shows when, you know, the sheepish dad or boyfriend has to go into the store and like, oh my God, I need to buy a product for my daughter, my wife, or my girlfriend. Oh, this is so embarrassing. Now we see in film and TV really real and helpful moments that show menstruation in all its complexity. And of course, menopause, so we begin with menarche, the onset, and then we end with menopause. And where we really need to go is that the lack of studies and research done. And I love that Forbes 50 over 50 is concentrating on menopause too, because this is such an understudied issue. But the resources just have not gone to half the population, women and girls, about menarche, menopause, and everything in between.
We talk a lot at ForbesWomen about how the lack of investment in research, medical research on women's health continues to affect patients who identify as female on a daily basis. And I think there's a lot of people in the 50 over 50 and in the broader Forbes community who are working to change that and to
Yeah.
spearhead studies that will improve our collective knowledge.